I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This week's episode is a conversation I did not ever intend to release on the main feed or on any feed. It was originally a private email exchange. Cameron and I read an essay by Marianne Corbett in the New Verse Review, the first issue of the New Verse Review, about Timothy Murphy, a poet who died 5-6 years ago. And this is not how people generally talk about the dead in public. It's not generally how people talk about dead poets in public in particular, but the concept of this podcast originally was that poets would have on-mic conversations they generally have off-mic. If this is, if nothing else, that. And I think it's probably worth saying that I don't think of this episode so much as being a verdict on Timothy Murphy as I do a reflection on on the lot that we all share as contemporary poets who are not super famous. Those of you super famous poets who listen, there are a couple. You're off the hook this week. But for the rest of us, I guess my message is tu hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère, to quote the most obnoxious of very famous poets, Charles Baudelaire. I'll close this introduction by reading a very short poem by Timothy Murphy. There are a couple that leapt out as potentially suitable for this episode, one being The Dead Poet and another being The Drowned Immortal, which is about the Chinese poet Li Po. I'll include links to those, but I thought this one maybe cut a little closer to the bone. This is called The Failure by Timothy Murphy. Tractor and combine axle deep in muck, seed corn and soybeans frozen in the field, the home farm pledged against a bumper yield. He has run out of money, time, and luck. What would his frugal Swedish forebears think to see their hard-won holdings on the block? There is no solace for a laughingstock in woman's arms, religion, or strong drink. Any day now, the banker will foreclose, summon the sheriff and the auctioneers. What will he tell his sons in 20 years? He cannot wholly blame the early snows. All right, so I haven't reread this, but I read it, I sent it to you. I had some thoughts about it. This was a post on I always want to call it New Verse News, which is wrong. New Verse Review. This was a post from Marianne Corbett, who is an erratosphere stalwart, and like, I think as evidence in this article, like a very selfless literary citizen. Like, she is somebody who is very thoughtful and diligent about attending to other people's work, and I think like is a skillful writer of poetry. And I thought, like, I had very, very mixed feelings about this piece. I think it's worth reading. I thought the piece was relatively well done. It called up to mind some real problems, I think. Yeah. So this is called Material Witness, Remembering an Abiding Debt to Timothy Murphy. Timothy Murphy is dead. He is an American poet who I met briefly in 2012 the one time I went to the Westchester Poetry Conference. He and his partner Alan Sullivan were very prominent and often feared figures on erratosphere and in the formal poetry world. I think the two of them, I think, were sort of the most influential tutors of Aaron Pachigian. My recollection is that they would force him to memorize
Hamilton poet. Yeah,
they lived out west. I think it's somewhere in the Dakotas or in Colorado, somewhere out there. They were involved with various schools and did lots of translation, lots of poetry themselves. They're both now dead. What else about Timothy Murphy should one say, or how, or yeah,
Well,
tell me what you thought about all of this. I'm curious.
I've heard bad things, but I'm not sure you'd want me to say them
Well, so
on
the
the
other,
podcast.
so right, like, so I have heard bad things as well, though to varying degrees. Like I've heard on the one hand curmudgeonly things, and then on the other hand, like slightly less winningly curmudgeonly things. But I
Oh,
also
I don't care about imagining things.
right. I don't know what yeah, like I think there some of this may just be like pure gossip in a way that is so unverifiable that it feels like it's not really fair game to air
Yeah.
publicly. But like, you
Oh,
know,
yeah.
he if nothing else, he certainly annoyed some people and had some very harsh words. Like I mean, one of the very few times I spoke to him, I mentioned that I was reading Beowulf, and he expressed like very severe disdain for Seamus Heaney, which is sort of
Well, I think he translated Beowulf.
he well no he did he basically said like I you should read my version. That version is garbage. Like her version is disgraceful trite. I think
Yeah.
like I don't know. I think Seamus Heaney's got some things to recommend him.
Yeah, I quite liked his version.
I think he's a he's pretty good poet.
Yeah.
But there were people who had very strong feelings about Timothy Murphy. He was not a like Alex Pepple is, I would say, like, well, all right, Alex Pepple's not really fair because he's more of a like Richard Wilbur seems to be somebody who, like, I don't think I've ever heard a bad word about it. I think people have only said, like, not everybody likes him. Not everybody is like his poetry is their favorite, but like certainly about him personally, I have only heard like
Mm.
the warmest comments about like any personal interaction with him. Eddie Murphy is not that kind of figure. He was a choleric, acerbic figure, and plenty of people had bad things to say about him, and he had bad things to say about plenty of people. That was sort of his role. That is some of what Marianne eulogizes in this piece, which is sort of a reminiscence of knowing him as a person more than it is a reminiscence of his poetry. Though she does quote some poems of his and talk about some of his poetry. She also
Yeah.
talked about his faith, and he was he a Catholic? He was a Christian of some kind at the
He was a
end.
Catholic. He was a
Yeah,
Catholic.
he was a Catholic, and I believe Marianne is as well. And there was
Yes.
some tension about that. I mean, he was openly gay, and yeah, with there was some tension
Yeah.
between that and his his partner Alan Sullivan died some years before he died, and so that was part of his sort of his personal mythology was the dead partner, the dead beloved partner, who was himself a pretty ferocious interlocutor. But yeah, I had thoughts about this. What? Yeah, tell me what you thought of it.
Well, okay. Well, I would try and be quick because I thought your thoughts were like exquisite thoughts. But like I think the funniest thing I found about the article was it's clearly not about him as a poet, but
Yeah.
goddamn, does Corbett choose like terrible poems of his to include? Like just god awful tripe. I mean, there's one poem which is just him telling three other poets that they should go to lunch with him again. It's just like
Yeah,
what?
that was not. I thought that was quite bad.
That just made me laugh. It's like, why are you including this in this article? Like,
Just so people know, like rather than us saying how bad it is, I'll just
yeah,
read.
do you want to read it out? Yeah, yeah.
And it was published in Light magazine, which is a magazine for lighters. It's called Breakfast at Brennan's. After a Cajun mass at the cathedral, I dream I'm buying brunch on Sunday morning. My guests, Louisiana's finest poets, Julie Kane, Gail White, and Jenny Reeser. We're pigging out at Brennan's in New Orleans. First turtle soup, then seafood jambalaya. Oysters diced and tossed in a Caesar salad. Fine Chardonnay. We're into our third bottle. I step outside with cognac and a snifter to take a break and fire up a Havana. Non smokers all, my esteemed colleagues order coffee and Brennan's famed bananas Foster. I'd I'd asked a sweet dream of the Blessed Virgin. Hendecasyllables were what she sent me, which, waking word for word, I have recorded. It's a hint, girls. When can I buy you breakfast? Hendecasyllables are just means 11 syllable lines, and there are a few different patterns of hendecasyllables throughout.
It's just I forgot that he claims that he got this from the
Oh yeah,
Virgin
he
Mary.
said the blessed Virgin gave him these lines about
Like the divine is sending you this? Find a better god. Like what?
So she quotes that, and she acknowledges that it's sort of light, and it acknowledges that it's light, but it also just seems like not
But
like
it's not funny.
deeply
Or like
pointless, like deeply
yeah.
deeply pointless.
Like I think like near the beginning there's a sort of little kind of gay sassiness to it, which maybe if he did more of that, it would have been at least more entertaining, but it's just
Like I was trying to think, like if you just sent this in an email to Julie Kane, Gail White, and Jenny Reeser, that would be fine.
it'd be cute, I guess.
Yeah, but again, it would be, to be clear, it would be not, hey, remember this time we had a nice afternoon together, and these are all the specific details I recall, and isn't it sort of, this is like a wonderful evocation of this specific memory that we have together. No, this is a dream I had about this time we had, and also come visit me in New Orleans and we'll have some good food together. Like that would be unobjectionable. That would be like a fine, friendly email to send to 3 people.
Yeah.
This is not to be published.
It's like, also, I'd just like to say, he has such rational dreams. I've never had a dream about like something positive or something I desired, about some like strange element thrusting its way in. Like I remember I had a dream when I was like 14 about like getting with my crush. But I remember like in the dream, we were like in my parents' bed, and I think like the girl had like a beard or something. Like I have never had one dream which is like a purely rational.
Man, Cameron, you're just right for the.
I know. Like that is by far not the worst. But like I've never had a dream which has just been purely realistic, and I'm amazed that he has. Like I'm amazed it's just him having dinner with these people. Like it's
very straightforward cinematic kind of.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is not good poetry. She in a way, like I give her credit for quoting this, because I think what I think is happening here is that she is, I mean, like, the actual service that I think this essay performs, and I think it does perform a real service, is not, what it's not doing is saying, here is a good poet, let us remember his good poetry. That is not what it is doing. And so in that sense, I think in a way this might have actually been a good poem to include toward the actual end that this essay is.
Yeah.
But yeah, so sorry, go ahead with other thoughts or criticisms or ideas.
Well, I mean, that's not the only poem.
Yeah, there was one other poem that was not as bad, but it was not. Yeah, it was not.
He had.
But
he has some poems. He has some poems in Poetry Magazine, I think Poetry Foundation, which aren't too bad. Like they have pathos. He has a great master of technical skill. He's clearly not a very good poet, but he's not half as bad as these lines would make one suppose if they were trying to be uncharitable.
This did not show him at his best.
This
did not show him at his poetic best. This might have, in a way, been like testament to something else. But yeah.
I have a very extremely bitchy comment, which is that like him and Sullivan mentored Puchidian is just an amazing demonstration of how mediocrity breeds mediocrity. But you can cut that if you want.
No, I mean, at some point I do want to get Aaron on here, and he can lay into you. I'll have you, and you can moderate a discussion between Aaron and Quincy Lair. Because I know Alexis has campaigned to get Quincy on here. I think I wrote him. I think I've written both of them at various points, but
Yeah.
I'll have to write again to see if they want to come, because they
Oh my
there's
God.
another legendary Eratosphere figure, a big
I
and the two of them have a long-standing feud.
I once found a thread where just like Poochidian's just like threatening to like to find him and beat him up, like to spit on him, and he's just like I wouldn't even spit on your grave because I don't you're not your little worm. It's amazingly funny. It's just
There's a great tradition in poetry of
yeah.
outlandish and hyperbolic threats and insults to other poets.
Yeah, and Quincy's just like, Aaron, why did you call me up yesterday night screaming down the phone? And Aaron's just like, because I just wanna spit on your face. It's amazing. I imagine if I moderated between them, I'd just enrage both of them by making sort of comments about my opinions of their verse. But let's go back to
I know I mentioned it before. It's very, very brief, and I do think like a pretty undeniably effective poem, very short poem that Aaron has written is his epigram for Alan Sullivan, which is I think it's just called The Vigil, and it goes.
It's his best poem.
All he was as hard to handle as truth, which we equate to light. Go somewhere dark and light a candle for Alan Sullivan tonight. I think it's pretty fucking good.
No, it's his best one. Yeah.
And so Alan Sullivan was Timothy Murphy's partner who died at that point.
But I mean, but then again, there are some really good stretches in Hamilton. You know,
so who are you comparing to Hamilton or to Lin-Manuel Miranda? Aaron Poochidian is the Lin-Manuel Miranda of the formal poetry world. Well, sure. I mean, yeah, like that's not a mere insult. Like there's a lot to admire in Hamilton.
Dag, he amazes and astonishes.
Dag. What? Just come on. Nobody has ever said Dag. Dag is terrible. But
it's like that Champagne Sharks episode where they say like he was watching more episodes of The West Wing than listening to rap music. And it's probably true.
Oh no, he is an enormous fan. Like apparently on his last performance as Hamilton in the stage production, when they did the curtain call, they played the theme music from The West Wing. Because
really?
It brought him to tears. Because it's like that is his North Star is The West Wing.
Yeah.
And it's very apparent in Hamilton. The West Wing has there's a reason it's a very popular show. It has a lot of charm. It has plenty of deficiencies that have been well discussed elsewhere. This is I found this to be a sort of a touching meditation on knowing this guy as a poet, as a critic, as a friend, as a sort of a curmudgeon. She quotes some of his poems and she talks about them and she speaks, I think, in pretty sunny terms about his poetry. There is an interesting moment, and I wonder, I don't know. I wouldn't want to put Marianne in an awkward position, but I wondered how precisely she meant this, or if what thoughts were behind this moment. But she said, she says he was extremely encouraging of her work and was very supportive. And he was he did a lot of work to support other poets, as Marianne. Again, my wife has said many times, Marianne Corbett is an extreme, to use a term that the only poems kids hate is she's a very good literary citizen. And she is. So she's very selfless when it comes to other poets' work. But then there's this moment after she says that Murphy was very encouraging of her work. She says, "Can I say exactly when his poems changed, taking a sharper turn toward faith? I can't, but in more than one poem, Tim points to an episode when, on the brink of suicide, he walked into the parish center at Saints Anne and Joachim and was talked down from the ledge of his despair. The books that follow from that point still celebrate the land and other poets, but are more dense, as I see it, with affection for the neighbors who rescued him, the priests who ministered to him, and the beloved ghosts who populate his memory. Prison Chaplain is one such affectionate poem. She goes on, and there's some, yeah, she wrote some poetry. She talks about some other things. It doesn't seem to me, when she says this poems took this sharp turn, it felt like it went unstated. But though she's right, like there is a greater emphasis on faith, and I think Prison Chaplain, which I believe that was in poetry. I think I looked at that one when
Yeah, it is.
it has some charm to it. It has some accomplishment to it, but it also struck me as being very facile in the way that religious poems sometimes are, and that I find disappointing, sort of
Do you want
existential.
to read it? Do you want to
Yeah,
read it? Because I read it, but I have no
to-
memory of it
Yeah,
whatsoever.
I'm trying to pull it up because the link in the article is not working for me. So let me find it.
He has a poem in poetry where he talks about a pope coming to him into a dream after he died. And the only thing I can remember about that poem is just a line where he talks about how I can't remember if it's a priest or if it's just someone, but someone raped him when he was free. And that
Oof.
line's always stuck in my head. It's just quite memorable, like amid the kind of blandness of him talking about how great the Pope was.
I'm just going. My computer isn't like none of the links for the Poetry Foundation are working on my computer. I'm going to try to pull it up on my phone.
Do you want me to
Yeah,
read
what
it
is
out?
going on? Yeah, I don't know what's going on my end. But yeah, read Prison Chaplain for us if you would.
Okay. Because there's prison chaplain for Stuart Longton. Heavy and grey now, dressed in deacon's robes. I see you in your Speedo at Floyd Lake. It's nylon clinging to those golden globes. You exercised for Moorhead football's sake. We hiked the Black Trail to Isaac Park, but now I see a deacon hard at work, explicating the gospel of St. Mark, a high school quarterback become a clerk. In the high sense, a boy with such good looks, you could have run to Hollywood and hoard, but turned to mastery of sacred books and the manly mimpsis of our Lord. Lifesaver, that was your job at Wilderness, teaching tenderfoot farm boys how to swim. Soul saver, I would call you now and bless any man who preaches St. Mark to Tim. We take our coffee outside for the view, patrol the walkabout with 12-foot mesh, where drunks can smoke. What has become of stew? The word, not on the page, but in the flesh. Oh, and then it has whatever the word is for something that comes after a poem. Prairie St. John's Hospital. I can read that again if you want, but
Yeah,
yeah,
read it one more time if you would.
sure, yeah. It's always like because I can't remember. I have to I'm reading it line like word by word. So
Right. Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
heavy and gray now, dressed in deacon's robes. I see you in your Speedo at Floyd Lake. It's nylon clinging to those golden globes. You exercised for Moorhead football's sake. We hiked the Black Trail to Isaac Park, but now I see a deacon hard at work, explicating the gospel of St. Mark. Our high school quarterback become a clerk in the high sense. A boy with such good looks, you could have run to Hollywood and hoard, but turned to mastery of sacred books and the manly mimpsis of our Lord. Lifesaver, that was your job at Wilderness. Teaching tenderfoot farm boys how to swim. Soul saver, I would call you now and bless any man who preaches St. Mark to Tim. We take our coffee outside for the view, patrol the walkabout with 12-foot mesh, where drunks can smoke. What has become of stew? The word, not on the page, but in the flesh. Prairie St. John's Hospital.
Yeah, it's funny. Like the very last turn of it, I like better than a lot of what precedes. What has
Mm.
become of Stu? The word. What is it? What is the line?
So what has become of stew? Question mark. New line. The word. Full stop. Not on the page, but in the flesh.
Not on the page, but in the flesh. Yeah. So it's a play obviously on the beginning of the Gospel of John, and remarking on this like one of the universal experiences of being confronted with a friend who
I'm
is at
trying
the
to
end of
work
his
out
life
if
is like he was this like handsome, strapping young guy that you like part of the joy of like knowing people is knowing like the health of their bodies at their peak, and you see him and you remember that, but he's this decrepit, skeleton at the end of his life, and that is very moving. I think that's a nicely done little moment. But like the
Yeah.
throughout the poem feels like extremely paint by numbers and facile. Like
Oh
you
God,
were
there's
a lifesaver at camp. Now you're a soul saver. You were
right.
those golden, like honestly, like complimenting the Golden Globes in a guy's speedo. It feels like the gay equivalent of a cringy straight guy, like a straight 60-year-old guy praising the body of a 20-year-old intern at the law firm. Just like don't say anything about her skirt. I know she looks good, and just shut the fuck up. Like it's gross and weird.
As I'm probably being hypocritical, but I kind of do like the Globes.
Oh,
I
it's
like
just
the Globes despite
it's such a,
myself.
like it's such a like hubba hubba like oh like it's just so cool.
Yeah,
But
I find
like
it
it's
funny
also
though.
just like there's just like so much sloppy facile like I'm sorry he played football for Moorhead, which is a
Yeah, so
college, but he
he played for.
exercised his balls for Moorhead. Like you mean
I
that's like
think no, I
that's
think he's talking about his ass. I think he's talking about his ass. And you
oh,
said
the Golden
yes.
Globes of
Never
his
mind.
ass. Okay, all right. I thought you were talking
Yeah,
about his balls. Yeah, all right. That's fine. Like that makes at least slightly more sense. But then the like
it'd be huge
you could have
balls.
you could have gone to Hollywood and Horde, which he ends it there to get the rhyme with Lord. Like for
Yeah.
one thing, I'm very annoyed by the use of Horde as an intransitive in that where it's like first like yes, is Hollywood full of whoredom of all varieties? For sure. Is it a total fucking Sodom? Absolutely. Is there much to despise in the morality of Hollywood? Of course, 100%. But that kind of like very facile, dismissive from a distance, like, well, hey, you're good looking. You could have gone and whored like all those whores out there in Whoreywood, but you saved souls. It just feels like so fucking lazy. And then
Yeah.
and they use it just like it's just like grammatically lazy on top of that. So like that, I found all of that highly annoying.
So
Though at least the
I think
globes and like being the ass makes more sense than the globes being the balls. Because then I was like, he didn't play for Moorhead's football team. He played for their sperm bank if he was exercising those.
the worst stanza is almost certainly lifesaver. That was your job at Wilderness, teaching tenderfoot farm boys how to swim.
Yeah.
Teaching tenderfoot farm does that always trips me up. And it's metrically teaching tenderfoot farm boys how to swim. Surely that's an Alexandrine. It's in the middle of pentameter. Soul saver, I would call you now. And yes, that's pentameter. So teaching trochee, tenderfoot. Yeah, surely tenderfoot farm boys how. Oh, okay. So the line wants me to say teaching tenderfoot farm boys how to swim, but that's just awkward. You want me to say
Second position trochee is really hard to get down.
yeah. Well, no, it's not. It's not a second position trochee. It's you're supposed to read it as an I am. So you're supposed to read teaching
Teaching
trochee.
tender.
Yes, yeah,
No,
tender foot.
nobody could possibly read
No,
it.
right. Tender foot farm boys how to swim is what it's
No,
demanding.
but
And
like nobody would like he definitely would have
no,
teaching tenderfoot farm boys. Like it's a bad like this is the problem with the second position trochee. I tried to talk to Elijah on Versecraft, said that your second position trochee is what a second position trochee is fine. You just don't want a third position trochee, which to me is like bonkers because the third position trochee is often fine. The second position trochee is deadly. Like
yeah.
it can be done, it can work in some cases, but it's like it just absolutely like a second position trochee is like that thing that you used to do in grade school where you'd like kick somebody's foot when it was behind the other foot, and then it would bring up and he would trip himself. Like that's a
But
second position trochee.
but it's worse. No, but it's worse though, because the second position trochee is put within a word that demands stress on the first and third syllable, even though the third syllable in the greater context of the line is supposed to be the first unstressed syllable of the third foot, right? So it's teaching
it's two rock
tender.
solid trochees followed by an extremely weak I am.
Yeah, so it's two rock solid trochees followed by basically a spondy.
Foot farm, yeah, it's a foot farm is a. I think probably farm has a stronger stress, but yeah, it is very much not an obvious I am.
Actually, no, this line is a metrical disaster, right? Because after farm, it's then boys, then it's how, then it's to swim. So not only are we then supposed to put the stress on farm over boys, we're then supposed to put the stress on how over boys. So it's
Farm,
it's
boys, how, yeah.
It's God, it's terrible.
Yeah, and I think
anyway,
probably somebody would complicatedly praise it for its some kind of mimetic value, but whatever. It doesn't. It's a clumsy line.
No, yeah, but there's no mimetic value. I mean, it's not. It's about tender, like the
What if
boys
they
have
were,
tender
but,
feet.
but what if their
Mitra isn't
tender feet were that they were tender trochee feet because they were didn't know how to swim? Did you ever?
Yeah,
did
that's not mimesis. That's just bullshit. Anyway, with the light that what I was going to say before I got distracted by this metrical disaster was that then the next two lines. So I'll do the stanza again. Lifesaver, that was your job at Wilderness, teaching tenderfoot farm boys how to swim. Soul saver, I would call you now and bless any man who preaches Saint Mark to Tim. Oh God, like bringing himself into the third person. Oh,
and
that's horrible.
To preach Saint Mark to I mean, again, it just feels very facile. Like it feels like I mean, honestly, like there's a certain kind of like very boilerplate, like cringy moral pablum that you get one version of it from like MSNBC and a different version from Fox News, and like this feels like a kind of vaguely conservative, definitely Christian version of that, like very, very safe, very automatic boilerplate moral thinking that I just like, I don't even know why you would bother putting in a poem.
Yeah. Like two comments. Firstly, why do Christian women publish this? And secondly,
wait, why do Christian women publish this?
Yeah, a Christian Wyman. Sorry,
Christian Wyman. Oh yeah.
Sorry, it's spelled women.
Christian women.
But but like that's how the machine says his name. So that's always how I think about it.
Machine pronounces because you listen to a lot of stuff audio. So that's the auto machine pronunciation of his name is Christian.
Yeah, Christian. Yeah.
I mean, that's because that's the famous shitty bad thinking thought experiment, or not thought experiment, but like trick that Bernard Shaw was a big proponent of phonetic spelling, which is an idiotic cause, like a totally like it's not even a quixotic cause, it's just like a moronic cause. But Bernard Shaw believed in phonetic spelling, and his mic drop demonstration of this was the famous spelling of fish, which was GHOTI.
What?
And he claims that, of course, fish, you could spell fish GHOTI because GH in enough makes an F sound, O in women makes an I sound, and TI in caution or some other word makes a sh sound. So like, ha, phonetic spelling, we get it. Fucking idiotic argument. But yeah, you're like, that would be the Bernard Shaw pronunciation. And so your machine is women should be spelled. It's not WOEN, but WIMAN, I guess.
Yeah. My other comment was just that, like, people say, oh God, the new formalists, they've had such a bad rap. Everyone says, they're conservatives, and their verse is just sort of homespun, sort of conservative jargon that has nothing to do with the world. And I feel like when they're talking about this, they're really thinking of poems exactly like this one.
Yeah, this is the worst kind of that. I mean, it's not the worst kind of it, because at least it's like just like talking nicely about a priest. The worst kind is when it like is actually nasty, or like this is very bland and benign, but it is just utter like stock conservative, like versified prose pablum.
Yeah.
Well, so she doesn't even quote that poem in the book. She just mentions it, and again, like he is, with the exception of that line we savaged, he's like skillful metrician.
Sorry. Can I just looked at the bottom of the page, right? And like in the related section, do you know, right? It says it says related collections So it's in a collection, right? The collection is football poems.
Football poems? Oh,
Yes.
oh,
Like what?
come on, come
That's
on.
hilarious.
Oh God.
Sorry.
Yeah, like
Go on.
let me end with just like the very end of Marianne's article. She quotes a poem which is about hunting because Tim Murphy was a hunter, and he writes a poem about hunting. She quotes it, and then she says, "I enjoy and admire this poem for a whole collection of reasons. Reasons that, again, make it a characteristically Murphy poem. The rhymes are nearly all true, and they crackle with unexpectedness and irreverence. The vivid meadow puts us right there with the pheasants and Tim. The contrast of country plainness with whiz-bang technology is pointed, and the comparison of GPS collars to diamond jewelry is richly suggestive. I chuckle at the rueful tone that Tim takes about wealthy hunters and his past losses, a tone that hints at the hard feelings he claims not to have. I smile at the subtle nod to the deity in the punning final line. It is a poem that conveys, through the world's material details, Tim's self, the complicated man to whom I and many others owe so much." I have like 10 different thoughts about that descriptive paragraph. And in particular, like the word that leap out to me are chuckle and smile. But I want to hear like your thoughts on this, because you had like a scathing response when I sent you this article.
Well, I did. I mean, I did, but your response was better. I do kind of, I don't know. I felt like I kind of just want you to read it out, but like you can also just, I don't know, use that to launch yourself off from.
Yeah,
My general sense is that it's bad.
yeah. I mean, it might. If I think like the way I read your response was that it was that this is evidence of a kind of a bad habit in the thought and the practice of
Oh,
new formal.
okay. Yes. Yeah. Well, I just want like new formalists are always talking about each other. And
Yeah,
it's like they don't realize that the only people who are reading them are each other. So that, it's just one will like a few of them will read Murphy and then talk about Murphy, but no one else is reading Murphy. No one else cares about Murphy or reads him. He's not known whatsoever. And I just it feels so stagnant. It just feels like they're always writing about the same people. Like I honestly think if New Formless went out and just wrote about poets writing free verse, it would be very fascinating. But like I don't, it just feels so stagnant. I feel like this is the reason that no one reads many new formalists because it's so stagnated and inward looking and sort of ingrown like a nail.
yeah. That's a yeah. That's a painfully apt image. All right. It's funny. I had no memory of this email after sending it to you. I think that the criticisms you have of this article, like just as evidence of a habit of thought and speech among new formalists, and again, like new formalist means a lot of different things. I think that Marianne's article is more aware of those kind of criticisms than of that kind of thought that you have than it might even let on. Like I
Okay.
think I enjoy and admire this poem for a whole collection of reasons. To me, like this paragraph is almost a tragic demonstration of an acknowledgement that Murphy just isn't a particularly notable poet, and yet was a person who mattered a lot to her in her life, and like was a person who cared about other people and who had like who had a place in the world. But and she, like her praise for his poetry, it's sort of like it's scrupulously accurate, but it reveals the sort of the flimsiness and the insipidness of any real virtue that one might identify. I chuckle and I smile at these little turns, these little
Mm,
poem, and I think like, yeah, that's about right. Like that's about yeah. Like
yeah.
when you read a poem like this from somebody that you cared about, then you'd be quick to say like, oh, that's kind of a nice moment. You hear that you did a little that's a clever little turn there, because like you want to find things to praise, and like you can find things to praise, but
But
but like, it
it's so
doesn't matter because
patronizing.
if you just read it as a stranger, you think like, nah.
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
that in itself is devastating. And I think like
Mm,
Brienne is very smart, and I think she knows that. And I think that's like, she knows in writing this whole piece that like he's just not that good. And so I'll look at I'll maybe I'll read. I don't know how much of this I'll leave in the podcast. But like maybe I'll just read what I wrote because I truly don't remember it very well. Um, and we'll see if any of it's worth keeping. But
it had a great impact on me. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll read it. You said that you thought Erasmus is dying, and I think I have outgrown it. You said the new formalists are a barren group. They have no curiosity. They keep writing about each other endlessly. I said, yeah, your verdict seems mostly correct to me. At the same time, I find myself touched by Marianne's dutiful reckoning with a figure who once felt larger than life and has now been, in artistic terms, effectively and correctly forgotten. Poets write for posterity, but most of us, even the ones who gain some small prominence within our respective communities, leave behind nothing of note. Or rather, nothing more than what most people leave behind who were not working and even living in service to ostensibly enduring achievements. Murphy meant something to a number of people in much the same way that most of us mean something to a number of people. But the whole premise of his life was dedication to the art form. Only it turns out that the art he left behind is, apart from the occasional felicity, mostly forgettable. So, what was the meaning of all the incalculable hours he spent alone wrestling with the craft? I guess what I mean is that this sort of fate seems to me to be what awaits most of us. I remember when Wilmer Mills, another beloved but lackluster formalist, died 12 or so years ago. There was an outpouring of affection for him and much celebration of his contribution to the art. But talking with his widow at the time, a scholar and a writer in her own right, I got the impression that even she thought his poetry was pretty unremarkable. It's one thing if one devotes one's working days to some mundane career that helps support one's family. In that case, nobody will later think much about your contribution to the world outside of your personal relationships. But then there's the consolation of knowing that your job did, in fact, help keep some region of the everyday world above water, along with, of course, actually producing an income for your family. Maybe you had a passionate hobby, bowling with friends or futzing over model trains in your basement. And apart from any relationships cultivated in its pursuit, no one will think about it when you're dead. But again, you always, unless you were well and truly delusional, treated this hobby as a hobby. What is it about a life in poetry that makes this sort of denouement feel so damning by contrast? I confess that while it is not especially kind or fair of me, I can't help but read even the gestures toward faith in the poems of Murphy cited here, as in so many by other poets, as a kind of mealy-mouthed hedging of bets, as if God might in the end provide what the muse had long since failed to. I don't know, man. You're quite young, so maybe all this seems merely pathetic, rather than, as it does to me, simultaneously pathetic and horrifying. I'm getting to an age and an accompanying lack of success that makes this whole ghoulish, well-meaning spectacle resemble less the laughable clanking of Marley's chain than the grim warning of the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Okay. Ooh, yeah. That was yeah.
That was a wonderful
one. Forgot I wrote all
wonderful
of that.
writing. Yeah. No, I don't. I think I'm with you in finding both pathetic and terrifying. I think maybe I can intellectually conceive that this may well happen to me, but I don't think probably both because of my own arrogance and because of my age, I can't emotionally conceive very well of it happening to me. And I'm sure I have constructed around myself a kind of emotional delusion, in as much as I do kind of trust that I will be greatly recognized and read forever and whatever. But I think I do certainly conceive that it is both very pathetic and very tragic. And it is like, and this is why like I didn't respond to email, because it seemed to me so both well written and so beautifully piercing that I felt like I needed to wait and like conceive of something to respond, like something worth to send back to you. And that's why I didn't respond to it instantly. And I guess we're doing that now. I don't know. I really did respond to that. Is it like now like a few weeks into the future? I don't know. Like, is there anything you would add or take away from that? Like, how do you? Yeah, what does that make you think now?
I think I pretty much stand by all that. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
feel great about it. I don't feel great about any of it. I do wonder because I had a conversation with Brian, I think on the Paging Dr. Plattsmouth episode when I tried to make a point about how there is something sort of singularly pitiful about a life in writing because you do all this work and it like even to the extent to which you have done anything, which is to like set words on a page, like that basically is invisible. So
Yeah.
like people come into your house and your house is a fucking wreck, and you're like, no, but I spent all day working. Like, well, where? Where
Yeah.
is it? It's fucking nowhere. And like on top of that, it's probably never going to get published and nobody's going to read it.
Yeah.
So they're like, and Brian tried to kind of argue that like, no, 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 this is just a matter of how work works, and this is true of everybody in the same way. I don't know. It feels a little bit different
Well,
than if
I,
you like have a boring day job and then have a hobby that brings you joy. That feels like that's not quite the same thing as this, like the way in which people who try to write poetry give themselves to it as a thing to get like it is a you are making like a living sacrifice to a god, and that god
yeah.
for the most part eats up your sacrifice and provides nothing in response.
Mm. I think also it's about sympathy. I think like if you go and work right a day at a like menial job and you come home, you've got nothing to show for it. Most people can be like, ah, well, that's shit, and I totally understand that. There's an understanding about that kind of like horror of working, but there really isn't unless you spend your time purely among writers. The same kind of group sympathy and understanding for a day spent trying to make words cohere into sort of something beautiful and strange on a page and just wasting hours and hours over it, right? There isn't the kind of same ingrained cultural sympathy for that as there is for working just like a boring day job.
Yeah, I mean, and a boring day job is like maybe you're just a cog in a machine, but like there's a machine in which to be a cog.
Mm.
Something got done, something happened, and you probably got underpaid, but at least you got paid.
Although,
And
to be fair, there is very much a great amount of work where not only does one feel like one is a cogging machine, but one feels like their job is completely redundant, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure, didn't you talk about someone sort of spoof Lagodi-esque corporate horror? And
yeah, yeah, exactly.
to some extent, corporate horror comes from the idea that not only are you doing something that you dislike, but is probably ultimately pointless and isn't even advancing things, is just sort of like a bureaucratic non sequitur, which is in itself stolen from Kafka.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it maybe there's like I talked to my brother's old friend back home, and he does some kind of tech business thing and is very successful, and he's like a very thoughtful, smart guy. But he asked me what I was doing, and like my job is my answer was what it always is, which is like, well, to the extent to which I have anything resembling a job, it's sort of like a weird, motley combination of things, most of which are sort of bullshit and none of which pay well. And also, I take care of my kids, and also I spend most of my time and energy like writing and doing a fucking podcast, and like he said something, I forget exactly what it was, but it was something along the lines of like, oh, that's great. Like he had some sincere moment where he said like, that's great to hear, and what was clearly meant was like, oh, you're devoting your life to something that you think matters,
Mm.
and not in a condescending way. And I think like that is the like if you are very secure in having a very conventionally successful and respectable life, then it is easy to see there's something tempting in like, oh, what about just making art, man? But like when people with normal lives fantasize about that, they're always pricing in, like they're always assuming that they would still have all of that stability and confidence of having a respectable life,
Yeah.
and then also get to be an artist and express themselves. And like it's actually in lieu of that. And it might, like, how much worse if you live in this sort of like selfish, parasitic, like shambolic way, and also it's still bullshit that's all for nothing in just the same way that it would be if you had some soulless corporate job.
Right. Yeah.
That there's something
Mm.
like pointedly especially depressing about that.
Mm.
The note that came to mind that may not be a bad like coda for this, it because it came up in conversation with Chris Childers a while ago, and Zara wrote in to say like, oh, this is like, she had a few thoughts. I won't try to represent all of her thoughts, but like among other things, she just said like, oh, I wish you had read this poem aloud when you mentioned it, and so maybe I'll read it now, because when I was at Sewanee in 2012, A. Stallings gave a reading, and she knew Wilmer Mills, who's the poet I mentioned in my email, who was another formal poet. She knew him and liked him, and like he was a very widely liked and respected person. Again, like she found a poem of his, and I remember my thought when she read it was like, wow, she managed to find a good one, which is that's not a great thought to have, because I
Yeah.
remember looking for poems of his and thinking like, oh, that's not that great. Oh, it's kind of cringy. Like it was like I was like, when she read it, I was like, man, she is like, she like snapped that one up. She found like that's one that's got some bite to it. But then, I mean, she did read a poem of his, but she also read this poem because she was also, I think, even better friends with what's her name? Shoot, Rachel Wetstein, who was that same generation who killed herself only, I think, a few years before that. And I think Rachel Wetstein actually was a pretty good poet. I don't know that she ever really achieved her potential, but like she has some. Yeah, I should maybe talk about her at some point, because I think she has some poems that have something to them. She was also like she was a far darker and more sarcastic and just sort of like cutting poet than Mills was. But what Stallings did in tribute to Mills was not. I mean, she read a poem of his, but then the real tribute was she read this other poem by William Corey. So this is William Johnson Corey. This is a translation of a poem called or a poem addressed to Heraclitus. This is not the Heraclitus, the philosopher who said, "You never step in the same river twice." This is a poet, and this poet is known only through this poem. Like this is a translation of a Greek epigram by Callimachus, and Heraclitus the poet was friends with Callimachus the poet, and Heraclitus wrote a book that was called Nightingales. And after he died, his book Nightingales survived, and Callimachus writes this poem addressing him and sort of saying, well, like the poem, your poem survived, Heraclitus. And then what sort of the like dark bitter edge to this poem, because Johnson then wrote an English translation of it that is itself maybe the more memorable version. Now, when we read this poem, we have literally no record of Heraclitus the poet at all, except for this epigram, that his book Nightingales is gone. It is lost to history. And maybe it was great and lost, or maybe it was mediocre and lost, but it's lost. So this is Heraclitus by William Johnson Corey. It's translated from Callimachus, but this is in its own right, as Childers pointed out, like this is a translation that then takes on deservedly a kind of the weight of a poem in its for its own sake. Heraclitus by William Johnson Corey. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old carrion guest, a handful of gray ashes, long, long ago at rest, still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. So she read that for Mills, which was the first time I read this poem. And of course, the poem of his she read, I've entirely forgotten, but this one has remained in mind.
Out of interest, do you like that poem? Do you find that poem sad and touching because of what it says, or do you find it sad and touching because of its context?
I think it's hard to. I mean, it's all. I think it's hard to disentangle, but I think it's quite well done. Like I think it's. I think even in a relative vacuum, it becomes impossible to read the poem if you have no context. But I think setting aside the like the William Mills context, if it's just the context of Heraclitus and Callimachus, I mean, I think it's a pretty. I think this is pretty close to the bone. I've had a more complicated thought about poetry, like writing poetry for the sake of like, is poetry really about language, or is it really about meaning or denotation? And I've come to have I have my natural sympathies, but then I've come to have like, yeah, I don't know. I'm going to get into that with Jonathan, but like the thought I had the other day was like, I heard somebody say like, people think poetry is about what you're saying, but really it's about language. And like, there's obvious truth to that. And like, obviously you and I like can like get nerdy and complain about the meter of some words and like the specific, word choice. And then we can talk about sound and connotation and mimesis and all these other things happening that are clearly all tied up in the fact that this is made in words and not in some other set of symbols or something else. At the same time, like part of me feels like so my daughter does taekwondo, which is a Korean striking martial art. Striking meaning that it's kicks and punches basically. And my sister, whom I also saw over the weekend, does jujitsu. Jujitsu is a grappling martial art. You do judo, I think, right?
Yeah, I used to. Yeah.
And in addition to, so with striking martial arts, you have to be much more careful about practicing them, because you can't just have some kids step into a room and start punching each other in the nose. And so the reality is that like my daughter is very good in her taekwondo classes. She's a deputy black belt. Like she's going to train for another year and then she's going to take a test to be a black belt. She's 10 years old. Like that's impressive on the one hand. She does go 5 days a week. Like she does a lot. She does it very, seriously. On the other hand, like any person, with 50 pounds on her would just like immediately crush her in a fight, like with no training at all, because it's all technique. It's all just like it's basically dance. Whereas with jujitsu, day one, you have to grapple somebody. And like, if you want to have a conversation about like, who's the best jujitsu fighter in the room, well, there's a very easy way to find out right now. And I think like, to some extent, when I heard the comment, like, well, poetry, people think it's about what you're saying, but really it's about language. Part of me thought like, like, it's sort of a little bit like saying like sword fighting. People say sword fighting is about killing your opponent, but really it's about steel. You're like, well, also it's about killing your opponent, because like maybe one of you has like a really great technique, but like the other one of you stabbed that guy in the heart. And so like to some extent, I feel like there's maybe my sympathies will always be on the part of communicating like the language. Like I think poetry that exists for the sake of the language can often lose track of like serving the meaning, serving the communication, serving the function that language has in the first place. So yeah, I think this is very much a poem in the plain style, but yeah, I think it's a straight razor.
I've a lot of responses to this. I'm interested that you like it, because I would have thought you wouldn't like it, because I'd have thought you'd have found the ultimate message uncompelling, because obviously like it's not true. like
right,
poetry
but that's
does
the thing. That's
die.
part of what. But I think that's part of what makes it so moving is that it's wrong.
Right. Okay. Yes, I
Just like
see.
because this is not William Corey making a philosophical pronouncement. This is
Mm,
William Corey taking on the voice of Callimachus to speak to his friend, who is a poet. Like this, to me, this poem is like a laconic, indelible, metered and rhyming version of Marianne's essay, which is,
mm.
you were a poet. I loved you. We used to stay up all night talking. And now you're dead. And all we have left are your poems. And in a way, like when she says, when I read Tim's poems, I smile and I chuckle. And to me, like it's such a like devastating compliment because it's like they're kind of corny and lame. And yet, like, I loved you. And so I want to find things to love in them. To me, like that is very much what Callimachus is saying when he says, still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales away. Like, how would you feel if you had left one book behind after your death? And I said, Cameron, the pleasant voices of your book are still around. You think like
Right,
that's
but isn't
faint fucking praise.
but isn't that a bit contextual based? Like, I'm pretty sure Milton says somewhere, or someone says like my sweet voiced Shakespeare and his like honeyed gifts. Like I'm not sure. Like, isn't
I think
pleasant
Milton is in bad faith with himself like 90% of the time.
right? But sure, don't you think pleasant is a little bit like isn't the sense of pleasant we have now a little bit different? How one would have said
Sure, yeah.
another.
He might have chosen a different word now, and I think I'm not saying that William Corey intended this poem to be a like a failed consolation, but I think that's the
Mm.
like. But I also don't think Marianne intended her essay to be a failed consolation. I
Well,
just
I
think
don't know.
that's what it ends up being.
I wonder if some part of her intended it because I think
No,
when you
I think
comment,
I don't think she intended it, but I think part of her knew it, and she's too
yeah,
smart, and she's actually too good a writer not to have the truth creep through.
right. So this is when like when she says smile and chuckle, I agree it's touching. But when this poet says pleasant, it just doesn't feel like there's enough intention for me to say, oh yes, that's touching the same way. Like I can imagine it's touching the same way, but it just doesn't quite ring home for me because it doesn't it there just is there doesn't seem enough intention behind that for me to totally believe that that's exactly what the poem's saying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. It's
You
a
see my point?
no. I see your point. I think even if you take pleasant, like today we use pleasant the way as a word that has lost its actual. Like we very seldom use the word pleasant with total sincerity and earnestness, right? Like usually when we say pleasant, we are using it as faint praise. And
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
not true. Was this 100 years ago? When was Corey writing? Victorian era? 150
I
years ago.
maybe I
It was
don't
here.
know.
He was born in 1823. So like 150, 70 years ago, whenever he was writing this. So yeah, at the time, pleasant probably had a more straightforward meaning, and so that it doesn't have the same. It wasn't quite as double edged at the time, but I still think that it's basically what he's saying is like your good lines, your verses that are good are still here. Like I think it still is, even as just like a bare statement, it's still so insufficient and so obviously false. And like what was definitely true when Corey wrote this was that the Nightingale's book was gone. Like it was long gone at that point. Like that was still already. And so like
Yeah.
when Alicia read this, she would tear. I mean, she genuinely teared up. Like I saw, like she stopped, and there was sort of one of those moments where she's extremely composed. She like rehearses, she practices. She's very, very poised. Like she lost her breath. Like she actually choked up and was crying. It's like she snuffed it. She smothered it up back, but she had a moment of like real tears in the midst of talking about Wilmer Mills, and did care about him, and like she wanted so badly for it to be for him to have been a good poet.
Yeah.
And like to her credit, she found a poem that I think it was a poem about rain. I'll see if I can find it when I do the show notes. But I thought, like, at the time, it was like, okay, that's all right. That's better than anything else of his I've read. And I think in an odd way, like, she chose this poem. And I think, I mean, Alicia is smart as they come. Whether she was conscious of it or not, like, that same failed consolation was certainly part of what she was communicating by reading this poem.
Yeah, well, this is why I think with all that context, the poem's very touching.
Yeah.
But I guess for me, I just wish there was more of the kind of self-doubt or the sort of the knowledge, or even the subconscious knowledge that what the poem is saying is false. I wish that was more engineered into a poem, because then I would find it very touching. But I don't know. I find because it feels mostly contextual, it feels kind of like an extraneous force field where I have to like put effort in to be touched. You know, like I have to hold these facts and say, well, this poem isn't really worth much. But the stuff around this poem makes it quite upsetting. I don't know. That type of stuff feels not distasteful morally, but kind of aesthetically distasteful.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say, like, in an 8-line poem, you learn that this guy Heraclitus was a poet in line 7.
Yeah.
Like, clearly, that's not actually that doesn't actually matter.
Well,
like, what matters is
unless
like the image that's most dividing is how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And like, that's like, that rings totally true. That feels like any writer, any young person, anybody who's ever been a night out, like, that's totally recognizable.
No, that's very recognizable.
Even like the like, you know, syntactical formality of the closing couplet feels like it's a self-consciously elevated moment that becomes further away from the actual experience of knowing this person.
Yeah, I don't know. I find the elevation, I don't know, it weakens the poem for me. And also, I mean, it is only mentioned the 7th line, but considering he may well have been quite famous, it may be that he was talking about someone who expected his readers to know was a poet. I don't know. I don't know.
Totally. But again, he might have been very famous when Callimachus wrote this poem. He was definitely not when Corey wrote.
Right. When Corey, yeah, but that goes back to but that's context again. I don't know. It's
sure. I mean, I think there's context in the, like, you need, like, at a certain point, if you strip away all context, then yeah, like, it's hard. Like, are you allowed to look up words? Are you like, what are you allowed?
Right. Well,
are you allowed to know what a sonnet is?
That's contained within the force field of the form. I like, that's implicit within the material.
Yeah. I mean, this is an argument about, there is a real argument here about, like, how much is fair to claim as a writer of poems, like how much is fair to presume.
I do wonder if all my kind of pseudo-intellectualism is just slightly beside the point, that I think it's a pretty poem, but I don't think it doesn't really affect me as it affects you. And I'm not sure how much worth.
The way that people always talk about things, it's that when you're younger, you're more engrossed in and more moved by shallow things, and as you get older, you're more moved by and engrossed in more substantial things. I don't think that's true. I think that they're just different periods in life that appeal to different sentiments, and I wonder if this is one where you have to be a little bit more, you have to have tasted a little more failure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll read it one more time just for the people who, you know, like to hear things more than once.
Before you say that, I would like to say that, like, going back to the sort of communication thing, I don't think I'd cast myself as against that. Like, I wouldn't cast myself as someone who thinks poetry is about language. I think poetry is about communication. I think I just interpret communication in a very different way than you, in that I don't know, it seems to me that the language itself can communicate at a fundamental level that isn't simply conceptual communication. And to be unlike, I've discovered a poet recently who I find very reminiscent of myself, but like, the thing I dislike about her poems before she turned to novels is that I find them they do seem to me to be just playing with language and just sort of exercising a kind of intelligence. And to me, poems do need to be attempted to communicate something. It's simply that I'm drawn to communications that are attempting to express something that's normally beyond words. And sort of, therefore, the words are brought to kind of the edge of what they are, what they can be, to try and get closer to this communication.
Say that last part again.
Like, it seems to me that what I really prefer is, or what I'm trying to do with my poems is certainly play with language to an extent, but always attempting to communicate something that is on the edge of language or something that words can't quite express, getting towards something that's sort of slightly beyond language. And that's why I think poetry needs to sort of bring this language to a kind of breaking point or a kind of vortex like, I don't know, rupture. Because it's not that they're trying to just, it's not playing with language. It's not, I mean, it is a game, but it's a serious game in as much as it's not just for fun, let me show you my language skills. It's attempting to do this in order to serve something more inexpressible but communicative. So it's still communication in my point of view.
I mean, yeah, that sounds right. My brain starts to get a little mushy when we talk about something at the edges of language. Like that starts to be a place where I feel like there's a certain kind of aesthetic leap of faith where I feel like, sure, something at the edge of language, something that's beyond language. I think like, okay, but I don't totally know what that, like it sounds like a convincing kind of thing. And I know a lot of smart people say it. And so I give it the benefit of the doubt as being meaningful. I don't really know what it means.
I think like language can describe reality, but attempting to describe or invoke a sensation of reality, even a sensation of just sort of the moment passing, is something that I think, you know, language and poetry is constantly striving towards, but I'm not sure if it can ever quite reach, because that is outside of language or beyond language.
Okay, so this actually gets toward a definition of description, which is something I'm interested in, but maybe is a longer conversation. Because I tend to think that the thing that we think of as description is something I would put closer to like legal writing, which I think is actually like a supremely unnatural and almost anti-linguistic form of writing. And that the actual effective description is not so much giving an account in language that corresponds accurately to reality. It's more about providing a series of cues that provoke the mind to respond in a way that is true to an experience of being in the presence of something.
Define cues here more.
And this is, I'm sure he was not saying this for the first time, but in at the poetry reading where I actually met Joanna, Brad Lighthouser said, you know, in a poem you take the line for the mountain, and the kind of the deeper wisdom behind that aesthetically is that you can give an exhaustive description in one sense of a mountain where you name all of the elements and you identify accurately their arrangement. But that's like just brutally, brutally tedious to read. And at the end of it, you might have like a somewhat like accurate catalog in your brain of the composition of the mountain. But what I think of as good literary description is the provision of images and sounds and language in a certain order and with a certain fleetness that stirs the mind to experience something comparable to what it might experience if it were in the presence of the thing being described.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I totally agree. I don't know. Are you trying to make a distinction between us? Am I
No. I think that it may be that if that's what you mean when you talk about something being at the edge of language, like that's totally how I'm completely on board with that.
Yeah.
But I think that's also part of what I think is, well, I won't try to defend this poem anymore, but like sometimes in what I really like in very plain, in like plain style poetry, is that it is allowing a line to stand for the mountain. And again, not because it stands for the mountain, but because we take it for the mountain. It throws a few little ingredients at you, and it does it in a way that is shapely and pleasing to the ear, and it tricks you into having a feeling that has something to do with the feeling you might have in this other circumstance or in the context that's being evoked. Again, like, I think of good description is closer to evocation than it is to
yeah,
an accurate correspondence.
Yes, exactly. Or maybe not. I mean, to be fair, evocation is itself a kind of an attempt to reach a correspondence that's more accurate.
Yeah.
So maybe more like a kind of denotative accounting. But like, no, I totally agree. I would just say that like, I would make the exact same comments for poems that are like dense. Like if you take Hart Crane's line, "and light drowned the mythic trillions of your spawn." I mean, I think like that's a very small, compact little creature with a very few ingredients, but it contains this kind of thunderous evocation of dawn coming up over all of mankind that in its like tininess evocates that without giving a great amount of detail.
Right. But my response to that is that when I hear that, I might eventually think like, okay, that was well put together. There's some smart stuff buried in there. But my response to it in the moment is like, okay, hold on, let me process that. Let me through, what are we saying here? How does this work?
Yeah.
Basically, it's like, to me, poems like that, and this includes like almost everything of Jay Wright's I've read, are like, if I sat down to be handed a poem, and instead you handed me a math equation, you said, solve this math equation, and at the end you'll find out what the poem means. Being like, fucking okay, fine, all right, I was never very good at math. All right, give me a second. Let me get a napkin to write down long division. To me, that's what it feels like. So it's like I believe it. It just doesn't make it. Doesn't. I don't feel it.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. But I mean, I don't know. That comes back to my ideas about paraphrasability. In that, like, I've read a lot of Geoffrey Hill. I often don't look up most of the references he has down because I can't be bothered. And to be honest, the poems communicate to me before, in a way, without getting the reference, in a way that I couldn't paraphrasably say what he just said. But I know I get the sensation or the feeling of what he just said. And for me, that is a kind of evocation that I, in some sense, will take over literal word by word annotative like paraphrasable description.
Yeah, because paraphrasability has been on my mind lately, and again, I don't want to get too lost in this topic, but I am coming to think that a lot of the poetry that we think of as being readily paraphrasable is really, it's sort of, paraphrasability is the tightrope that it walks. But a lot of it, I think, like, it turns out to be less paraphrasable than one might think.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with that. No, that'd be a good episode. I'd like to hear that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm just, because I'm going to have so many hours to process on my computer.
Oh yeah, Jesus.
I should finish, but let me quickly read this poem one more time, and then we'll talk more again soon. This is Heraclitus by William Johnson Cory. It's translated from Callimachus' poem to Heraclitus. I will say, like, on the website, because I pulled this up online to read it, and the first footnote misidentifies Heraclitus as a more famous Heraclitus. So the point about his obscurity and his lostness to history is should really be driven home. All right, Heraclitus. They told me, Heraclitus, they told me you were dead. They brought me bitter news to hear and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old carrion guest, a handful of gray ashes, long, long ago at rest, still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales awake. For death he taketh all away, but them he cannot take. Carrion refers to a region, I think, in Greece, but it's a word that is used for a kind of marble. So I wonder if there's not ancient region of Southwest Asia Minor. But I know Syrian marble is frequently used in, like, you see that in a lot of museum pieces. I wonder if there's not a little hint there that Heraclitus is a monument now rather than a man.
Not for long.
That was my conversation with Cameron about Material Witness Remembering an Abiding Debt to Timothy Murphy by Marianne Corbett. I do recommend taking a look. It's in the first issue of New Verse Review. Apologies to everybody for this episode, but I don't know. We tried to tell the truth as best we could, as best we understood it. I'm sure we got a lot wrong. You can reach me at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. If you like the show, you can find more at The Secret Show, which is a supplementary podcast. It's a new episode every week. Sometimes it's sort of an addendum to something on the main feed. It's often its own beast, though, including if you want to hear a very splenetic review of Paradise Lost. You can check that out now at sleerickets.substack.com. Thanks for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.